as they come along. So before we get underway, I do want to make a note that this session is being recorded by the Canadian Association, rather the Canadian Society for Spirituality and Social Work and the Nova Scotia College for Social Work. And we record these events to create access for those who can't attend live. And we use this session as well, the recording, to support our advocacy work and our professional development events. So if you're not happy or have a reason that you don't want to be recorded, then of course you can change your name on the screen, and you can also turn off your video.
Although I do want to say that the recording only captures the speaker and the content that will be shared from the PowerPoint. And we will have breakaway sessions, but those will not be recorded. Sorry for interrupting.
Very good. Well, I think, and you said it, so there you go. So unless you're speaking, you won't be captured in your likeness. Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Cassandra Hanrahan. I am the president of the Canadian Society for Spirituality and Social Work. Very happy to be here today. I'd like to welcome you, and also to take a brief moment to introduce our speaker today, Anne Siritsky. Anne serves as the professional practice and advocacy consultant with the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers. And prior to this role, Anne worked in several capacities, including providing community-based counseling, hospice and palliative care social work, community organizing, healthcare leadership and administration, and teaching social work as well. Anne's doctoral research is in compassion fatigue and burnout for healthcare workers. So I'm sure we'll learn more about Anne as Anne begins the presentation. So I'll leave it to Anne to share more with us. I won't take up any more time, so I'm going to turn it over to you, Anne.
Thank you so much. And I am grateful to be here with you all. I'm going to just share my screen so that everyone can hopefully see. And there we go. So I'm grateful to have been invited to offer this workshop on spirituality, ethics, and social work competence. 3 topics that are very important to me, and the intersection of which is even more important to me. So with that, I do want to begin, and I want to invite us just to take a moment and take a deep breath. Be present. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I am in Mi'kma'ki, in Unma'ki to be exact, and this is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. Their inherent rights to this land were recognized in the peace and friendship treaties which Mi'kmaq, Wolastoqiyik, and Passamaquoddy people signed with the British Crown from 1725 to 1779. This series of treaties did not surrender Indigenous land, resources, or sovereignty to the British Empire, but instead established rules for an ongoing relationship between multiple nations. The treaties were later reaffirmed by Canada in Section 35 of the Constitution Act in 1982, and they remain active to this day. Without action, acknowledgements are empty. Whether you are with us in Mi'kma'ki or joining us from elsewhere, please consider whose territory you are in, your relationship with that land, and your relationships with the Indigenous peoples who have lived and continue to live in that place. So I invite you to take a moment to introduce yourselves through the chat, using the original names of the locations from whence you are tuning in. And if you do not know the accurate Indigenous names, I invite you to Google. And let us begin by creating a community that is rooted in this recognition and acknowledgement. So please take a moment to introduce yourself, say where you're calling in from, And please, if you don't know, please Google to find out the accurate Indigenous names of the city or province where you are calling in from. And as you are doing that, I invite you to reflect on how each of us, as individuals and as a collective body of social workers, can hold ourselves accountable to reconciliation with Indigenous peoples here and across Turtle Island. Lalia, thank you all. And I want to make a few further reflections because we really cannot speak about spirituality and ethics and social work without first taking a moment to reflect upon our role as social workers, historically and currently. The ethical mandate for reconciliation and justice is profound, and our code of ethics itself has been declared to be inadequate and in need of repair. Furthermore, we need to recognize that the lack of integration of spirituality into social work is reflective of the larger dynamics of the ways in which colonization and religion have both worked to influence the development of social work. Thus, the need to focus our efforts on reconciliation and justice must be central to any integration of spirituality into social work. And therefore, this is a significant part of this topic, and it will be a significant part of our session today. So a little bit more about me. My mother, oops, that is, excuse me, I'm a little kerfuffled, hold on. So my mother is French Acadian. And if you're not familiar with the French Acadian history and their own relationship to colonization, I invite you to reflect upon that further. We have played a dual role, both as arriving and colonizing, but also as being colonized by the British as well. And my father is a Holocaust survivor. So you can see on the top right, in white, that is actually the documentation of the murder of my grandfather in Auschwitz. And then on the top left, you can see a picture of my father and my mother, and that is actually the farm where my father was hidden. And in the black and white at the top left corner, you can see the two farmers who hid my father during the war. And so growing up, my father was always trying to make sense of what happened to him and his family and processing the Holocaust. Obviously, trauma is intergenerational. And so one of the things that he really spent a large time reading about is trying to understand why it happened. And he reread the New Testament like a million times, looking for anti-Semitic comments and verses, trying to understand why. And of course, as you may know, the Catholic Church in particular did have a unique role with Nazi Germany, but Canada as well, turning refugees who are trying to escape away with the words "none is too many" when asked how many Jews who were trying to escape they were willing to take. So that's just a little bit about me and my subjectivities. I think it's important that we always name and honor our own unique particularities so that people who are listening can hear a little more about that. So I am actually a rabbi in the Reformed Jewish perspective. And I did that before then realizing that in addition to prayer, I wanted to work towards social justice and advocacy more globally. And that's what led me to social work. I'm also a board certified interfaith chaplain, and I have a doctorate in ministry and interfaith pastoral counseling that included 2 years of training from the Postgraduate Center for Mental Health in New York City. And so I will be drawing upon this additional training as part of my, my presentation today. I'm also non-binary and queer identified. And while born here, I have spent several years working, teaching, and living in the United States, which is where I received my master's in social work. So let's take a moment and what exactly are we talking about today? The integration of spirituality into social work. And the reality is we can't talk about spirituality without also talking about and thinking about religion. The concept of spirituality is often confused with religion. Religion involves the patterning of beliefs and practices into social institutions and community and traditions maintained over time, whereas spirituality has been defined more as personal, but there is an intersection to that many times when spirituality is informed by one's religious training or beliefs or upbringing or exposure. But it has been stated that there are 3 dimensions to spirituality: making personal meaning out of situations, coming to an understanding of self, and appreciating the importance of connections to others, which of course, all 3 of those are very intricately tied to social work. Since we're all social workers here, I am not defining social work for you all, but you can see the obvious intersection there. But I wanted to share just a little beginning to center us. The reality is that there is an overlap between religion and spirituality. So when we talk about spirituality, it's important to be mindful that it often can be heard or interpreted through religious lenses, and it can often be communicated as such as well. But of course, there are differences. One is more individualistic, one is more subjective, one is more organized and more authority directed. And so this is one. There are many different ways of defining and distinguishing, but this is one. So spirituality involves meaning making and searching to discover what is sacred. And this journey can take either traditional pathways or non-traditional avenues, such as involvement in 12 steps or meditation. Some suggest that spirituality is a broader concept than religion, and spiritual expression may or may not necessarily involve a particular religious faith or institution. But in that ambiguity is where I hope to locate my talk today. So the first question for you all is, where would you put social work? If we think of spirituality here, religion overlapping, but also overlapping with culture and coping. The question is, where would you put spirituality? So that is actually the first breakout group. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop share for a little bit, and I'm going to divide you up into different breakout groups. This is going to be your breakout group for our afternoon together. So please start by introducing yourselves. When you are broken up, you will be asked to join. So just click join. You will go into like a little breakout room, and then we will bring you back. I will bring you back at the end of this. This is a brief share, so I'm going to give us about 5 to 6 minutes for the share. And again, the question is, where would you put social work when thinking about this framework? Or do you agree with this framework? Or so just thinking about your own personal understanding of the connection of social work to culture, religion, coping, and spirituality. I'm going to stop share, and I am going to give you permission to unmute, because that will definitely make the conversation much more pleasant. And I'm going to also pause recording. Okay, so hopefully you've had a chance to have good discussion around this. This is the first part of our conversation. And, there's no right or wrong about really anything. But this is certainly, one can agree wherever we put it, that social work and spirituality do have a strong connection. And indeed, that's why this organization, the Canadian Association for Spirituality and Social Work, exists. It's a very important connection. There's, of course, a lot of research that shows the impact of spirituality, mindfulness-based interventions. Dialectical behavioral therapy, for example, is just one example of the ways in which we can integrate into evidence-based practice the spiritual practices. And there's a lot of strong research that shows its impact and effectiveness. So spirituality definitely matters. I took this very beautiful graphic that looks at spirituality from a Mi'kma'ki perspective and the many different aspects of spirituality. And we could do a whole session simply on the different aspects of spirituality from everyone's different perspective. But I just simply wanted to name its importance and recognize it. So it's important, it's valuable. Should we proceed full speed ahead, or should we proceed with caution? And you will see that in brief, if I were to summarize my session, I would say it is about proceeding with caution. And the reason for that is because a lot of people have religious trauma. A lot of people have had adverse religious experiences, and that can really impact people. So there are lots of different words and phrases for it. Religious trauma syndrome has actually been suggested as a term. And there's a lot more that can be said, but a lot of people do identify with this. And that is something to think about when using even spirituality, because of the intersection and because of people's associations with religion. It can impact how they experience even the word spirituality. So there are many possible reasons why someone might have adverse religious experiences. It may have something to do with their upbringing. It may have something to do with the ways in which religion is integrated into some parts of politics, especially in the States. It may have something to do with LGBTQ plus folks, the ways in which we have been proclaimed an abomination by some religious perspectives. So all of these can contribute to adverse religious experiences. Of course, clergy sexual abuse, which it pervades many religions, as sexual abuse pervades many different areas. And the unique trauma of clergy sexual abuse, as opposed to sexual abuse in general, is the ways in which a person's religious faith and spirituality can be permanently damaged when an authority figure ordained engages in such traumatic behavior. And then there's the history of colonization. So you can see in the bottom, there's a protest in the Philippines. There's a lot of, one has to, looking at the Crusades. There's been a lot of very important writing on the ways in which Christianity has functioned as a tool for colonization and colonialism. And we don't have to look very far for examples of that here in our own country. The ways in which the residential schools were run by religious institutions, and how that has impacted several people as well. And a lot of the reason why the religion is tied in with colonialism is because of the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius, which basically says that any land that is owned by someone who's not Christian can be claimed in the name of Christ, can be named in the name of Christianity. And here you see a papal bull from 1455, which encourages anyone who is of Christian descent to enter into those lands, claim it as theirs, reduce all people to perpetual slavery, and appropriate to himself and his successors the kingdoms, dukedoms, counties, principalities, and convert them to his or their use and profit, definitely not her. So that, if you're not familiar with this movie, The Doctrine of Discovery, or you're not familiar with the concept, this is narrated by Buffy St. Marie. It's a wonderful documentary. I encourage it highly. This is some of the documents around Truth and Reconciliation, which requests specifically the repeal and the dismantling of the doctrine of discovery. This is still a current issue as well. It has not been repealed, so therefore many countries, including Canada and the United States, are based in this, and the law that governs this, the institutions of government are based upon and reference the doctrine of discovery. So that is something to be aware of, because it can impact some people's experience of religion. And so for over 100 years, as I'm sure you know, many traditions, not just Catholic, but Anglican, Presbyterian, United, and also unofficially Mennonite and Baptist, partnered with the government in running the residential school system. And this book, They Came for the Children, speaks about the missionary work of converting those individuals as part of the colonization process. And so as social workers, recognizing our own role in supporting the implementation of residential schools and affirming the approach to child welfare that led to the 60 scoop, but that continues to impact the ways in which we are seeing an overrepresentation of certain groups of people in the child welfare system, is something that we as social workers have an obligation to be aware of and to begin to recognize and own as part of our own labor of reconciliation. And the thing is that this collusion with religion is not by accident. So I don't know if you can see here, I'll move this picture of me, whoops. But Eurocentric social work can be traced to Presbyterian preacher or different religious leaders who initially worked to organize poor relief through churches. And some of the early roots of social work can be found in organized religion, Christianity specifically. And there is an idea that there were two approaches, secular settlement houses and more overtly religious charity organization societies. But if we actually look at the funding and documents of even the settlement houses, for example, Jane Addams in the States, you can see here a quote that this is really intended to be an expression of Christian spirituality and faith. This is obviously a much larger topic, but it is something that I wanted to just simply make us aware of, because the social gospel movement did advance colonizing government's power by creating shared symbols, rituals, values, and narratives to consolidate power. And social work did emerge out of this ethos as we know it today. And a large part of the settlement houses was assimilating refugees, immigrants, working to socialize wayward girls. And that is part of the Eurocentric colonizing roots of aspects of social work that I invite us to be mindful of. So if religion was such a big part of social work's founding, what happened? How come we are now in 2022 and most social work educational programs do not even address it? Why are most social workers not trained to address appropriately spiritual needs or religious diversity? So many reasons. Again, this could be a dissertation unto itself, but one important part of why that is no longer the case can be attributed to the influence of Abraham Flexner, who ironically, I spent several years working on Abraham Flexner Way in Louisville, Kentucky, where his house was. So Abraham Flexner basically discredited social work as a profession and said it was not, medicalized, it was not legitimate. And so part of trying to fight for legitimacy for social work has been to distance from religious roots and embrace the medical model. However, some things don't change. This is still part of colluding with government because government itself has sought to distance itself overtly from religion, although one can still see, for example, just this past year, Nova Scotia stopped having our Lord's Prayer, which is of course a Christian prayer, in its official proceedings, but there's a lot more work that needs to be done around that. But the shift to the medical model is also reflective of the growing power of pharmaceutical industries to the government. And so when we're talking about, for example, social work and current discussions over what can social work diagnose, which certainly is a topic that is very heated here in Nova Scotia right now. This is a much larger issue that is important for us to consider. So given all of this, which was really also me part of trying to set the background and the stage and the context for this conversation, what should we do? Certainly, one part of this is that we want to be working towards decolonizing social work. And that is something that we at the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers is doing, and that the Canadian Association of Social Work is doing. It is a very important but challenging labor, but it is an important part of how we can evolve. So, for example, our repositioning social work in mental health in Nova Scotia, as well as our social policy framework, which advocates for decolonization amongst many other principles, are some of the ways that we are trying to address this on a larger systemic macro level. So what does this mean for us potentially as individual social work practitioners, therapists and counselors and social workers when considering how to integrate spirituality with social work? So my first suggestion is that we have to proceed with caution. And I put this here, content is like water. You put water in a cup, it becomes the cup. You put water into a bottle, it becomes the bottle. You put it into a teapot, it becomes the teapot. So too, spirituality, just simply add spirituality and stir into social work without the effort to decolonize or to become aware of the larger context is potentially dangerous and can trigger people's adverse religious experiences as well. So the first principle, and this is the basic principle of medical ethics 101, do no harm. That is the first principle, and it is a good goal to work towards. And that certainly is my goal for all of us today. What does it mean to do no harm? So the first part is to know oneself, to learn, study, and also reflect upon ethics. Learning how to do so in an ethical way. And that is really what I'm trying to bring us to today. So quick review of our code of ethics, and thinking about when and how to integrate spirituality into our work and into our practice, given all of the caveats and potential concerns that there might be. So it is important for us to do so, but to do so in concordance with our first value, which is respect for the diversity and self-determination of all people. So the first question to consider, that I invite us to consider, is how does our ethical mandate to show respect for the diversity of individuals in Canadian society translate into what we learn about other religions? So first and foremost, part of diversity is learning about religious diversity and being aware of the ways in which our understanding might be different than others. So here is our next small group discussion topic. Given all of this, social worker A wants to provide culturally appropriate and safe services, always a lovely ethical goal, to client B, but does not know about client B's specific religious beliefs, but believes that all religions basically are saying the same thing, so uses I language to talk about their beliefs, encourages client B to do the same with the goal of modeling I language. So I invite us to reflect on this situation, which is a very, very common situation where a social worker or a therapist may not know about their client's specific religious beliefs. Talks, well, I always do this. Tell me more about how you do this. And what would the client feel? So with that, I'm going to stop, and I'm going to stop recording. Okay, so you were having a chance to discuss this question. Here are some potential answers. Of course, please feel free to put in the chat any reflections that you all had, so that we can all share with each other. So it's possible the client B might feel grateful for the safe space. They might feel unseen and unheard in their unique diversity. They might feel a microaggression of someone imposing their religious beliefs onto them. They might feel like instead of receiving therapy, they have to teach their therapist who did not bother to do homework. And they may possibly feel unsafe. So these are some possible feelings. There are probably a million others. Feel free to add. It might be really helpful and healing for some people, and it may be completely not for others. Our job as therapists is simply to be aware that our actions can have potentially unintended consequences, and to be aware of what those might be. What is certainly true is we want to be careful not to proselytize. And when we are social workers or therapists, we are in positions of power. And we might unintentionally say things or do things that are overtly proselytizing. But I think most of us know not to do that. The question is, what might we do unintentionally and less overtly? So for example, your therapy office. If you have little biblical quotes, or if you have things in your therapy office that show a specific religion, then it might be personally meaningful to you, but it may have a chilling effect on your clients who might see that and be like, oh, I think I know what such and such religion is about, and I therefore feel unsafe because of my own personal assumptions about it. Doesn't mean it's true, simply means that some people might be triggered or feel unsafe by clothing that you're wearing, by signs in the office, and that is something to be also mindful of. So one would say that the perfect solution would be to try to stay clear of religion, focus on spirituality as neutrally as possible, stay neutral. Now, quick little pop quiz in the chat. Looking at this red sign saying keep calm and stay neutral, what on that sign is not neutral and maybe not going to produce calm? All right, I see a few chat responses. Awesome. So yes, the crown, colonizing, and the cross. So we don't, these little like subliminal messages are everywhere, and our task is to reflect on how one's office or the way we present ourselves might, or our signature at the bottom of our emails might potentially convey a message that some people might consider to lead them to feel unsafe. So I wanted to share a little story, personal story. And actually, I am going to stop share for a second and reshare that with the ability to share sound, because I realized I didn't do that. So I had an opportunity to have a conversation with someone recently, and I was talking about some of the things that I've shared with you all today about the concerns around how social workers might use spiritual assessment tools and other things, and we will talk about spiritual assessment tools at the end of this, that might potentially cause harm or trigger people's adverse religious experiences or perpetuate certain forms of colonization. And this social work practitioner, who will remain nameless, said, well, I use something that is a spiritual holistic inquiry process. It was developed by a chaplain. It's a wonderful, wonderful tool. Let me share a little more about it. So I went and looked at this SHIP spiritual holistic inquiry process. And this was the website that I saw. And I am going to play the video of it. I'm not going to play all of it, but I do want to invite you to listen. Wonderful questions. Also wonderful questions. Very wonderful questions. I don't know the word strife, but okay. Besieged may be a theological statement that people don't feel comfortable with. Creator, also a religiously specific term. But still looking at this, I receive this, I go, okay, maybe. And then I see this. I'm not going to keep playing this, but this was the inclusive, non-colonizing spiritual assessment tool that this practitioner suggested that I consider using. So I would like to invite us to take a few moments and discuss some possible ethical considerations about using this assessment tool, and just to discuss a little bit more about this, try to see it from multiple perspectives, and what would be an appropriate response to this practitioner. So I'm going to pause recording again, chat any of your comments. I am going to now continue with our presentation. So potentially, hopefully you saw lots of potential ethical considerations about using this assessment tool that has been shared with many social workers. And what I wanted to do is use this as an example. So when someone suggests to you a spiritual holistic inquiry process, and you look at this and you're like, oh, this looks nice. What is above, before, below, behind? Lots of different perspectives. That sounds lovely. So the question is, you want to look at this a little further, and you want to see, okay, here at the top left, it says ministrants. Okay, I don't really know what that means, but let's keep looking. So you want to do your homework. So you go to About, and you see right here, digital resources for healing, hope, and harmony. Looks lovely. And then here is this, it says, it's inspired by Jesus's admonitions regarding loving kindness. Now, of course, Jesus had many very important, beautiful teachings about loving kindness, about radical solidarity, about open-armed kinship, and about non-judgmental servant leadership. And many of those traits are very inspiring. We talk about here, it says, we move beyond the first do no harm to an active interventionist approach, empowering all who ask simply, how can I help? All very lovely. Certainly the reference to Jesus is religiously specific, but otherwise very lovely. So what I want to do is I'm going to put us back into small groups for another 3 minutes. And I want to ask you this question. Can the assessment tool, the look behind, above, before, below, can it be separated from the context in which it was developed? So upon looking at it, it is, developed by a Christian organization. Can it be used or adapted to other contexts? So I want to invite us to have a discussion. I'm going to give you another 4 minutes to go back into your breakout groups, continue your conversation, but specifically, do you feel like it can be adapted? And if so, how would you adapt it? What would you do to make it more effective? Can tools that come from a specific context be adapted to make them more interfaith? Or if not, why not? So I'd like us to focus a little more on this particular issue. So again, please go into your small groups. We're going to spend another 4 minutes on, can this be adapted? And if so, why? Thank you, Danny. Okay, so welcome back, everyone. This was a complex issue, and hopefully you had a robust discussion. Feel free to continue it in the chat if you would like. But there are multiple perspectives around this. I probably haven't done a very good job at remaining neutral. One can never do so. This is a perfect example. But this is why I believe very firmly in evidence-based spiritual screening tools as a way to try to ensure safety and ensure that what is being done is effective. That said, many of the tools, there's a lot of research that can show that a lot of evidence-based tools are not actually as universally useful as they would have us believe. So here's a couple of reviews. Several instruments for spiritual assessment are really not quite as validated with cross-cultural samples. I remember my first research project that I worked on, I used a spiritual assessment tool. This was about 20 years ago, that was supposedly validated, and it was completely invalid for the population that I worked with. And so there's a lot of critique around evidence-based practice and cultural assessments. But that being said, it does go through a peer review process, and it does have the potential to be at least slightly less harmful. But this is why the ability to think critically is so very important. If you are not familiar with George Pachette, he is the leader of spiritual care research. He's at Rush University and does tremendously wonderful work in developing spiritual assessment tools that are appropriate and that are developed within a context that is interfaith, interdenominational, non-religiously specific, that pays attention to colonization and decolonization. Here are a couple of tools that can be used. One great tool that is pretty useful for most social workers to begin an assessment on the role that spirituality might play is to look at either genograms or ecomaps and think about spirituality as one component of that. So, but when asking, always tread carefully, because we never know what might come up simply by asking, because the ask is spirituality a part of your life? Tell me more. Or are you connected to a religious community, which might seem to the practitioner like a neutral question, can feel super loaded and triggering. And it may in itself seem to imply that there should be a connection, and there may not be. So it's really important to tread carefully, even when doing an assessment. So all of that is really part of our first value of religious diversity. But it's also connected to social justice. So when thinking about our code of ethics, which again, our code of ethics, this is an outdated code of ethics, but since CSW has not yet presented us with a new version, that is what I am using. But religion and faith can, for some, be a form of privilege and blindness. So thinking about spirituality from a social justice perspective, we need to be mindful of how we assess and recognizing that religion can be a source of trauma for individuals. And the first part of fulfilling the ethical mandate of thinking about social justice when considering spirituality is, have we done our own work in reflecting upon ourselves, our beliefs, our biases, when it comes to privilege and social location? So for example, if I believe that my religious tradition is the way to heaven, then how does that impact the way I work with people who have a different religious tradition than me or no religious tradition? So it's very important for us to be doing our own work in reflecting upon ourselves. And our job as social workers isn't to transmit our beliefs to our clients. Our job as social workers or therapists is to help our clients access those religious and spiritual resources that they need. And if they don't need them, to be respectful of that. And so we have to learn to balance multiple conflicting values and concerns and to be aware of all of the potential minefields that might exist. And to think about how is social justice related to spirituality when it comes to our clients and when it comes to ourselves. And those answers might be different. So I invite you to start thinking about it. We will have one last breakout group where we're going to have a chance to talk a little more. But I do invite you to think about some of these questions. Feel free to share in the chat and discuss. The third ethical value, because I'm going over our code of ethics, is service to humanity. So fundamentally, when thinking about the value of placing the needs of others above self-interest when acting in a professional capacity, that pretty much resolves the previous question, right? Because it's not about our needs and it's not about our beliefs. Our task is to help our clients access those resources, be they spiritual or otherwise, that'll help them in their functioning. And so our job is to be able to assess effectively and then figure out how to help them access those resources, not to transmit what works for us over to them. So we want to be putting others first and not forcing our beliefs on others as part of this ethical mandate. And we want to be thinking about spirituality more broadly. Now, some might suggest that social work and therapy is inherently a spiritual process, right? Because spirituality is about helping people find meaning. So that is something fundamentally spiritual. But the question is, does it need to be named as such? Because naming it as such might make us feel good, but it might not make the client feel good. And recognizing whose needs are being met within any kind of social work interaction is a critical ethical consideration. So certainly many people would believe that this principle itself, service to humanity, is inherently spiritual. Some might also connect it to their personal religious beliefs. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to share that with our clients. The role of spirituality could be helpful for us when reflecting on self-care. It could be very helpful for our own self-care. Certainly there is a lot of research that shows its effectiveness in dealing with stress, and certainly social workers do experience a tremendous amount of stress. So there is an important place for spirituality in social work, but I would submit to you that its primary focus ought to be in terms of what helps us stay centered so that we are able to adhere to these ethical values. So our last little breakout group, and then I have a variety of other things that I want to share, is what does spirituality mean to me? How does it relate to my self-care? And what are some ways that spirituality nurtures and informs my practice in healthy, ethical ways? So with that, I'm going to stop share once more. And I'm going to give you all the ability to unmute. I forgot to do that last time. Pause recording. So hopefully this is brought up lots of good conversation. it's a very nuanced topic, the integration of spirituality and social work. So with that, I want to invite us to think about, continue going through how ethically, what does our code of ethics have to say about this? Certainly one component of our code of ethics, value 4, integrity, has to do with also boundaries. So boundaries are an important part of thinking about how what works for one person may not necessarily work for another. And they are intended to be mutually beneficial, and can help maintain a positive and helpful relationship with clients. Our job, again, is to rely on our personal coping tools, but to work with our clients to determine what works for them, and to be mindful that it may be super helpful for some, it may be less helpful for others. We also want to be mindful that just because someone identifies, for example, by name or label as the same religion as us, that does not mean that we can assume that we know what they believe. We can assume to know whether they or someone that they love have had adverse religious experiences. So we never want to be making assumptions. That doesn't mean, of course, that spirituality isn't a very important part of our own personal self-care, and that can look very different for each of us. So I invite us to share in the chat perhaps some ways in which certain spiritual practices might be very helpful. So one thing that was very helpful when working in a hospital, a lot of our nurses and social workers would find it really helpful when leaving a client's room and they're doing their hand washing, which now there's even more focus on, to take a moment and take a deep breath and exhale and wash off that stress, wash off any vicarious trauma we might have absorbed. And that was a spiritual practice. Use that as a chance to do some deep breathing while washing hands, to build into what is already a packed schedule, some spiritual practices. Maybe you have other spiritual practices that you use for yourself personally that would be helpful. So please feel free to share in the chat some of those. Our next value is confidentiality in professional practice. And that is, of course, a very important one. And it's about trust. So the code of ethics of confidentiality is about the trust that is placed in us. And again, we want to reflect on ways that we might unintentionally break trust with our clients, sometimes before we even say a word. So we want to be attentive to that as part of our mandate to create safe space. Now, the last thing that I really wanted to spend some time talking about is competence. So our code of ethics talks about competence. The word competence is hotly debated, and rightly so. One can never be, so for example, competence in multiculturalism or anything of that nature. We can never be experts in other people's culture or religion or beliefs or experiences. So competence is certainly a word that sometimes has been used in ways that can cause harm. That said, it is important for us to think about our scope of practice, because when we work outside of our scope of practice, we might unintentionally cause harm. And my hope is that today's session can really help us think about that more critically, because spirituality, while an important part of social work, is not something that many of us have been trained on. And attending a webinar does not necessarily make us an expert or even competent. When thinking about spirituality and social work. And whoops, sorry, trying to move the picture so you can see. When thinking about the spirituality and social work, let's take a moment to do a self-assessment. And this isn't a breakout group, this is just for us to think about. When tempted to bring spirituality into a social work encounter, here are some questions that I encourage us to think about. Whose need am I meeting? How much training have I had in spirituality? Am I working within my scope of practice? What are the tools that I'm using? Who developed them? Have I addressed my own unconscious bias in this area? And that's really the piece that I want to invite us to focus on in particular. Now, spiritual competence means, or competence when it comes to social work and including spirituality, involves, for example, doing a good assessment and then making a referral for someone who might be more of an expert in this area. Again, our job is to help people access resources, not to do everything for our clients ourselves. If working within a hospital, chaplaincy and spiritual care is a whole discipline that I'm going to talk a little more about. And making a referral to the chaplain would be the best strategy. If not, there are other resources that exist, and it would be important to try to make a referral when possible. So let me talk a little bit about what is a spiritual care therapist, practitioner, or chaplain. That is somebody who has had an advanced graduate degree in theology and religious studies, 2 years of postgraduate and interdisciplinary training in medicine, counseling, and world religions. And they have also been put into what's called a clinical experiential education process, where chaplains or spiritual care providers are intentionally placed with a diverse group of peers, people of diversity of age, background, religion, race, and they spend 3 hours a week in group therapy and group supervision with them for 2 years. There's also individual supervisions, years of integrating feedback of others on our blind spots and how we come across to people who are diverse and different, and also reflection and action verbatim training. So for example, part of the training involves when meeting with a client in a practicum setting, for example, going back and rewriting every single part of that conversation as we remember it, which already is faulty, and then thinking, why did I say X? Why didn't I say Y? What is the clinical reason why I said that? What is the spiritual reason that I said that? Which spiritual framework and theory am I using? What couldn't I have said? And then after that, you bring that to your diverse group of peers, and their job is to help you think of your blind spots. So the goal of this, and then the additional training and supervision before board certification, where peers assess whether we have integrated all of these different perspectives. That is part of what is involved in the training of a chaplain or spiritual care provider. It is intensive, and it involves actively spending years focused on one's blind spots and learning about diversity. I believe that social work could really benefit from something this experiential and focused on diversity. But many of us have not gone through this, and therefore it's important to be wary of how one's blind spots might impact our clients. This is a little bit more information about clinical pastoral education if this is a topic of great interest. And there's multiple years and very cohesive framework with specific learning outcomes. And in terms of the scope of practice for psychospiritual therapists, they have to be certified. They have to be educated at the master's and doctoral level and have a minimum of 2,000 hours of postgraduate clinical training that integrates knowledge of self with knowledge of religious, spiritual, philosophical, psychological, and cultural frameworks. And it specifically involves training to work on how decolonization and colonization might be impacted, and working on all of one's personal social location and how that can impact the resources that we access. So here are some of the standards of practice of clinical spiritual social work. And it's important for us to be mindful that this is a whole field. So while we may have a great interest in spirituality, it's important for us to reflect on what is our scope of practice, and when we integrate spirituality into social work, to what extent might we be stretching beyond our scope of practice. Now, if this is something of great interest to us, there's lots of training that is available, but it requires in-depth learning. It requires a good year or two. There's the 1 unit of clinical pastoral education is 16 weeks. That's the first unit, but it involves some very in-depth experiential learning specifically to address the ways in which unconscious bias might be impacted. And then there's how do we integrate evidence-based models that are truly intercultural and validated across multiple religious contexts and backgrounds and cultural backgrounds? And how do we integrate that into our knowledge base? So in conclusion, what should we do? Should we do nothing? At some level, we want to make sure we do no harm. But we also know that spirituality is an important part of a human being's existence. It can be super effective. So what else should we do? We should begin by knowing ourselves, being careful with boundaries, thinking. When you are tempted to bring in spirituality, is it about your needs or the client's? Spirituality can be especially helpful for our own self-care and spiritual journey. Here are a couple of tips. Hopefully you've been adding in the chat lots of other fabulous ideas of practices that can potentially be helpful or good ideas to adopt. One of the things that we at the College of Social Workers Nova Scotia mandated is now 2 hours mandatory every year of self-care, recognizing that spirituality, self-care, balance is an important part of ethical social work practice. So this is a very important step. The next is really thinking about how culturally competent are we when it comes to religious diversity. How many of these signs and symbols do we know or understand or recognize? How many things, when we say we know or know about it, is it because we attended a webinar? Have we experienced worship with them? Have we talked with people? Have we read? When we say we have a familiarity with a different religious belief, what is it that we know? And even thinking about different religious beliefs, we also want to think about the diversity wheel, the ways in which people who are located at different points through the intersectionality of diversity may have different experiences about their respective religions and may have worked through their own ways of reconciling or not. And even if, let's say, we, for example, have not made sense of how one belief could coexist with one identity, that doesn't mean that our clients have not found a way for it to work for them. So part of cultural humility is also religious humility, and recognizing that our profession invites us to continue to study around literacy and equity, diversity, and we will be actually offering a variety of educational tools to look at this more firmly. But this is years of professional development opportunities right here. What's important to know is all of us have blind spots, and it doesn't mean that we're bad people. When we hear the word bias, we have to recognize that that's inherent to being human. We all have limitations based on our own location, and what we don't know about different faith traditions is significant. So hopefully this helps us not only inspire to learn, but when meeting our clients, recognizing there's so much we don't know, and trying to make an accurate assessment of what we understand, what the instruments are, looking at some of the tools, identifying levels of well-being, identifying how they may or may not intersect with religious beliefs, and then identifying possible sources of resources for the client or making appropriate referrals. And then there are evidence-based spiritual interventions that exist, and that is something that is worthy of another conference, because there's only so much one can pack into 2 hours. But there are some very useful tools. I presented on some of them through the CASW in the fall, and those videos are available. That was session 3 of my webinar, and I'm happy to do that again at another point. And I'm happy to talk with you, because I'm going to have actually time for some questions. So last but not least, so feel free to put a couple of questions in the chat. Most importantly, I invite us to stay within our scope of practice and get additional training if this is an area that we want to specialize in, and recognize our limits. Be aware of what we don't know, be aware of our biases, work within our scope of practice, acquire our own supervision when working in new areas of specialization, and refer when clinically indicated, for example, if the trauma is deeply spiritually rooted. So there are some practitioners, a growing number, who are specialized in adverse religious experiences. Specifically, there's a lot of beautiful research happening now on conversion therapy, and specifically there are a growing number of clinicians trained in how to work with people who have experienced conversion therapy. So stay tuned, because the college, Nova Scotia College of Social Workers, we are going to be presenting on that later this year, and keep learning. So here's some of my references. I will share my slides. I am going to stop recording.